Modern science will soon be able to bring back species from extinction. Today's video is going to talk about what de-extinction is, how it's being conducted, and discuss some of the conservation, moral, and ethical issues and concerns with de-extinction. So today's video came because I read this article, Why a Genome Can't Bring Back an Extinct Animal, and it brought up a lot of very good points, as well as I think gave an extremely well done and well researched overview about what de-extinction is. So when we speak about de-extinction, there are three main different types of de-extinction. There is backcrossing, there is cloning, and there is genome editing. So let's start with backbreeding, because I think that is probably the most, that's probably like the first example that we've tried with de-extinction. So up on the screen is a auroch, or at least a depiction of an auroch. The auroch is a cattle species that was found in Europe, but is now extinct. And there has been work since, I believe, even the 1920s about trying to bring back the auroch by breeding cattle to have the same traits that the auroch had. Essentially, selective breeding for traits that the auroch possessed. This is very similar to breeding a dog, for example, for a specific trait like droopy face, long ears, etc., etc. And selective breeding is nothing new. We've been doing that agriculturally for thousands of years. And this is a form of de-extinction. But it highlights a very, very important nuance of de-extinction. And that we're not really bringing the exact species back, right? Instead, we are bringing back an ecological equivalent of a species, meaning that it fulfills the same ecological role as the species that went extinct. So if we want to think of another taxa, let's say that beavers went extinct. Let's put a beaver up on the screen because they're cute and they're cool. So of course, if you're not familiar with beavers, they are a North American mammal. I believe they're also in Europe. And they are well known for taking sticks and making dams, which have a huge influence on the surrounding ecosystem. It fundamentally changes rivers, creates lakes, and they are an ecological important species. Let's say one day they all went extinct. They were hunted to death because everyone wanted to steal their paddle tails to make ping pong paddles. And then you, an intrepid researcher in the future, decide to start back crossing some rodent species to make a beaver again. And you may selectively breed for webbed feet, you may selectively breed a tail to be wider, and after many, many generations, you have something that is the ecological equivalent of a beaver. Is it actually a beaver? Is it the exact same species? No. Rather, it is an example of forced convergent evolution, right? You are selecting for traits that fulfill that species' niche, that fulfill that species' role in the ecosystem. And this isn't, pseudoscience. This is being done. Again, the auroch here. This has been a long-going project, and you can see that there are many cattle breeds used in the Toros program. That's what they're calling it. And they're trying to make something they're calling Aurochs 2.0. Aurochs 2.0. And again, this is totally a valid thing, but this is going to get into a deeper debate that we'll talk about later on about, do we really want to bring back the species exactly, or do we want to bring back an ecological equivalent? So, I mentioned three different types: backbreeding, cloning, and genome editing. Let's talk about cloning. Cloning, as I'm sure you know what cloning is at least some level, is, creating a genetic copy of some organism. If we wanted to clone me, we would take my genetic material and then make a genetically identical organism from my genetic material. And cloning has already been done for de-extinction. Let me introduce to you the Pyrenean ibex. So this is a species that was, in the Pyrenees, but it was ultimately succumbed to extinction due to overhunting, due to competition from other cattle species that were introduced by humans, and a wide variety of factors, just like any other extinct species. And this taxa was successfully cloned. So when we speak about cloning in this sense, What they are doing, and what they did, let's say what they actually did here, was they took the egg from a goat, a regular goat species, Capra hirsus, and just like most other mammals, you need the genetic material from two partners to create a viable offspring. Normally, this would be, if it's a goat egg, it would usually be a goat sperm cell. But in this case, they actually took the tissue culture from the last surviving Pyrenean ibex. Her name was Celia. And they interjected her genetic material into a egg cell of a goat. Now, this is where you might be thinking, well, wait a second. Isn't that just creating a Pyrenean ibex goat hybrid? After all, you're taking the genetic material from the goat and the genetic material from the Pyrenean ibex and putting them together. It's actually not the case, because they did something really, really cool. They removed the nucleus from the goat egg. The nucleus is inside of not every cell, but it's inside of the cell, and it contains the genetic material for the organism. All this genetic material is the recipe for life. It tells an organism, a developing organism, to develop these, this dark fur, or to develop a curved horns, antlers, horns. Yeah, horns. Pretty sure. Pretty sure horns. Anyways, it tells it to develop in a certain way that is different from every organism. And this genetic material is often very similar between organisms, right? We share 99.9% of our genetic material with chimpanzees, but in that 0.01 difference, that's what, separates us from chimpanzees. And so by removing the nuclear material from the goat embryo, you are left, from the goat egg, you are left with just the genetic material of the Pyrenean ibex, which can then develop. And this is noted as the first taxon to become unextinct in 2003. We say that with a quotation mark, right? Because that individual that was born only survived for a few minutes and ultimately died from lung defects. It's no doubt the cloning process likely gave rise to those lung defects. I would be hard-pressed to see an argument where that wasn't the case. But technically speaking, that animal that was once extinct was born alive. Of course, the technology can be refined, and I think that's where we're going with it. So what if we took the selective breeding of the backbreeding concept, and we kind of combined it with cloning? Well, that's where we have our modern tools. That is where we have the genome editing. So the biggest pusher for this genome editing process and de-extinction that has been getting the most news is through Colossal. Colossal is the organization that is bringing back the woolly mammoth, a species that went extinct 10,000 years ago plus. And on their website, they actually have a very, very good step-by-step process that I want to walk us through. It's a 12-step process for resurrecting extinct species. And yeah, I think this is a fantastic, cool technology. We'll speak about some of my personal opinions in a bit, but let's first start with, step one. So again, keep in mind, we're not bringing back the exact species here, okay? And we'll show you why. So the first step is to collect Asian elephant DNA. Asian elephants are, I believe, the closest living relative to the now extinct woolly mammoth. So by first collecting and then step two, sequencing the DNA of the Asian elephant, we are able to have a backbone to build our woolly mammoth. And I really do mean build, okay? When we say we're collecting the entire genome, the genome is just the entire genetic material of an organism. So of course we have genes for blonde hair, me, blue eyes, and all that. But the genome contains everything from regulatory genes to actual structural genes to, literally everything. Then the next step is to collect viable woolly mammoth tissue samples and then sequence the DNA and the entire genome from those tissue samples. And this was already done. They were able to find a really well-preserved woolly mammoth in Siberia, collect tissue samples, and then extract and sequence the genome of the woolly mammoth. So now we basically have all of the instructions to build a woolly mammoth. And then what you do is you identify traits to edit with the Asian elephant genome. You are editing that genome directly through CRISPR technology, which I'm not going to cover the nuances of CRISPR here, but it's revolutionizing biology and is an absolutely game-changing technology. So this is where I want to draw that parallel back-to-back breeding with the auroch, right? They were trying to selectively breed in traits that were indicative of the auroch, and they're breeding that in using several cattle species. Here, instead of, say, backbreeding Asian elephants to get a woolly mammoth, instead they are very directly highlighting the individual genes that are found in the woolly mammoth and not found in the Asian elephant. They are then using that CRISPR technology to edit those genes, that's step 6, and then insert these woolly mammoth genes into the Asian elephant genome. So some of these genes, the one that they are really focusing on is cold-resistant genes. I don't know exactly what those genes are, now that I'm thinking about it, but I know some of it is, for example, extra hair that the woolly mammoth possesses. There may be other physiological genes that are indicative of a cold surviving species, as well as just, any genes that are in the woolly mammoth, not present in the Asian elephant. The reason you're using that Asian elephant is because their genomes are theoretically very, very similar. It's be much easier, for example, to turn an Asian elephant into a woolly mammoth than it would be to turn a tree into a woolly mammoth, right? You want to have very similar genetic backbones to work off of. Once you find the genes, once you add the genes, then you can start to verify that the traits are expressed in the hybrid cells. So when we're saying the hybrid cells, we're in essence making a hybrid, right? Because you're taking that Asian elephant backbone and then you're adding on genes from the woolly mammoth. So this is more or less creating a hybrid species that is just very heavily favored towards the woolly mammoth. You want to make sure that the genes are expressed, and it will be noted that it's actually kind of similar to that Pyrenean ibex. I need to double check. Yeah, so they have 50 cold resistant traits. But we won't worry about it too much right now, what I'm thinking. But then you're going to an embryo transfer. This is exactly what I was looking for. So when you transfer that embryo, they're putting it inside of an African elephant. But just like they did with that Pyrenean ibex, they are removing the nucleus from an Asian elephant egg. Again, removing the genetic material from the Asian elephant and implanting that egg with the woolly mammoth nuclear material, right? In this way, it's almost like changing the recipes in a recipe book to make a chocolate cake instead of a vanilla cake, right? And then they are implanting that fertilized egg, that embryo. I'm actually not sure if fertilized is the correct thing. It is fertilized. I mean, it's viable. And they're implanting it inside of an African elephant. This way they can, I'm not sure why they chose African elephant over an Asian elephant, but that's, I understand they're doing African elephants. Then it gestates, just grows, just like a normal pregnancy, and then the birth of the woolly mammoth. That's the proposed plan. Many of these steps have already been completed, such as taking the genes and sequencing the genes. And all that really remains is to, well, create a woolly mammoth. And this is where I want to transition less from the science and more into the philosophy, the ethics, the morals of this. From a conservation standpoint, even if you disagree with bringing back the woolly mammoth, like just that specific taxa, it is undeniable that these tools, these genetic tools, are going to change conservation forever. Okay? Normally, let's say we have a population that is heavily inbred. It's lacking in genetic diversity. We would often have to backcross and do artificial selection, do artificial pairings. This is actually what a lot of zoos do to maximize the genetic diversity of that species. Well, now we can create genetic diversity, right? We can very directly edit those genomes, implant it into a surrogate, and now produce an offspring that is more diverse and can add diversity. Or, even more specifically, we could add in genes that help the survival of that species. That's getting into a very, very nuanced, very case by case discussion. But I'm saying is that we will have that tool in our wheelhouse. In my view, let's just say we have a population of some imperiled species that lost some genetic resilience to, let's say, cold. Like they really struggle now in the winter when they used to not. Well, we could reintroduce that genetic material that has been lost to a population, right? So that's a very strong use case. And by doing this de-extinction, we will learn that technology. There are major issues, I think, where the de-extinction argument really focuses on is the idea of we bring back a woolly mammoth and then we release it back into Siberia or into, far North America. And now that species that went extinct 10,000 years ago due to both humans and climate change, it is now in this area and may not be good for that species. I want to say that I actually really struggle to see the people who are doing de-extinction ever say that. They never say that. They don't say, we want to bring back a woolly mammoth and chuck it back out into Siberia. They're not saying that, okay? That is some hypothetical that is constantly brought up. And I really struggle with why that particular narrative dominates the conversation. Because, again, they're not saying they're going to do that. But also, conservation has an extremely long history of reintroductions. We just do. We have reintroduced wolves to Yellowstone. Reintroductions, I mean, that's just one classical example, right? So when we are being very nervous about reintroductions, I think what the argument is really saying is that we do not want to, we being the conservation community or whatever, doesn't want to reintroduce the woolly mammoth. But by developing the technology for the woolly mammoth, we would be better able to reintroduce species that we recently lost, right? So we could de-extinct something like the passenger pigeon, which was the most highly abundant pigeon species or bird species in the world before it was hunted to extinction en masse. We could bring back the Tasmanian tiger, which very recently went extinct in terms of the world's history, right? We have video of Tasmanian tigers, right? So we could bring back that species, or hopefully bring back that species. And I really just want to focus in on that because let's say that we don't bring back the woolly mammoth, and that's what's dominating the discussion. But what about the other species that we could bring back? What about the species that recently went extinct, undeniably because of humans, directly or indirectly, and we were able to bring them back? I think that is by far, the best reason for pursuing de-extinction. And then we get into a very, very tricky discussion about what even is a species. So throughout this, I've kind of mentioned that we are not really bringing back the species, rather we are creating an ecological equivalent to that species. And yes, but I will say the concept of the species is human created. And if you've worked in taxonomy, if you've worked in biology, you worked in ecology, you understand that those lines between what a species are is very, very loose. It's not well defined. And I guess in my head, when we bring back, say, a woolly mammoth, we're not going to have the exact woolly mammoth. We're not going to have the full gamut of genetic diversity that it was exhibited in the woolly mammoths before they went extinct. We're not going to have the full array of genes that were present. And what we really have is a hybrid Asian elephant woolly mammoth that is just more woolly mammoth than Asian elephant. But when it comes to its ecological role, does that matter? And this is a real question. It's not a rhetorical. I mean it. Like, does that really matter? In my worldview, in a lot of cases, no. I don't think it matters as much as we want to believe it. Because we have lost something. It's already gone. But being able to bring something back that is an ecological equivalent is better for the ecosystem overall. And it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, and it fulfills the same ecological niche as a duck, then doggone it, it's a duck. So I think there's a lot of nuance, and I've seen this discussion play out in real life. Classic example that I know about is the Florida panther. This was a species, subspecies in Florida that was suffering from major inbreeding. The populations were declining, and ultimately they ended up introducing Texas panthers, some panthers from Texas, to Florida. And yes, you can make the case that now there's not really a Florida panther, there's just Texas panthers in Florida. But is that worse than having no panthers in Florida? And I think that's how we need to frame the conversation around de-extinction. And just one last note that I really, really want to touch on is that there are a lot of issues that come into the side of this that are tangential. Tangential, but very, very relevant to this discussion. When we're talking about breeding in surrogate species, of course, this is happening in captivity, which the captivity of many animals, particularly things like elephants, is very nuanced and, in my opinion, pretty unethical. Almost all elephants in captivity have major psychological and behavioral problems, and I don't want to diminish that. Some places do it right, the vast majority do not. There's also the ethics of genome editing, which are entrenched in a long history of really, really bad and bigoted science. And I understand the trepidation that comes along with that. And it should be in the discussion. And, of course, there is the total morality of, are we playing God, right? Which, for me, non-God person, we already do it every day. We already do it every single day. We already decide what species lives, what species dies. We do that en masse. This is just a next extension, and I really do think the greater good is so much greater than the potential moral issues that arise from it. Personally, there are many taxa that I would love to see back. And when we talk about conservation, the biggest worry that a lot of people have, and it's such a valid concern, is that if we can bring this species back from extinction and the technology is foolproof and we know it can be done, what's the point of saving any species? Personally, I don't buy that argument. Because we could apply that argument right now. What's the point of saving habitat because we have zoos? We have private collectors, right? What's the point of saving habitat? We have that species there. And yes, some people do see taxa, do see conservation as just a checklist of, do we have this species still alive? I don't think that the vast, overwhelming majority of conservationists are going to fight for that. And while you can make the case that politicians, governments, and everyday citizens may not have that support, I personally do not think that narrative will overwhelm. And I don't think it's going to be an effective narrative. But at the end of the day, I want to know what you think. Let me know your comments down below. If you have a topic you want me to cover, let me know. And if you're new here, hi, how's it going? I'm Dylan. If you've watched to the end of this video, you're cool as hell. You should consider subscribing. Thanks, and yeah, have a good day.